So this morning, we are starting off with one of my favorite people, Bonnie Heitsch. She is Assistant Attorney General at the Oregon Department of Justice. Bonnie has been so instrumental in all the work that we do. We consult with her, ask her questions, and the first time I met her, she came to the now defunct planning business leadership team and talked about tort claims, and it was really interesting, and it sparked some really good conversation. So she will be providing information, but we do have time to spark some conversation. So have questions for her. Let's have a good discussion. So take it away, Bonnie.
Thank you, Diane. Well, welcome. How many of you are new to ODOT in the last year? Quite a few. And then the rest of you have been here for up to 5 years, 6, 10? 30? Well, I've worked with ODOT and for ODOT for the last 27 years, and I found it to be a fascinating, ever-changing agency. And I hope those of you that are new to ODOT will find it as wonderful and inspiring as I have, and those of you who are with ODOT continue to want to make a career out of it. I think there's wonderful opportunities for you. There's been families and generations of people who have come through, and it kind of feels like a family to me. And I have had the privilege of kind of being on the ODOT team, being legal counsel for the last 20 years. And I want to support and help you to the extent that we can. I am really excited to be here because, as you all know, you have a tremendous journey ahead of you with the project load that's scheduled out. I'm heartened to see that there are changes in your project delivery process to make things a little more consistent, maybe a little more uniform across the state, so that you can deliver. It's the biggest. I've never seen a project list as big as what you have in my time with the agency. And I know you're shifting from being more consultant-driven in the way that you're delivering projects as well, and that also requires a few tweaks and changes in the way that you're doing your own business. And I'm glad to see that you're all here. I'm glad to see that there's leadership here to try to get everyone on the same page, because I think that will help you in the long run, and it certainly will help the agency. These consistent processes and particularly the documentation of your process that are built into your processes will help protect you from liability as well. And that's what I'm here to talk about, is potential exposure to liability. Particularly tort liability. So there's just three themes that I want to talk about. I want to talk first about how the Oregon Tort Claims Act actually protects you really well, each of you as individuals. How we have a particular defense that will also help protect the agency, called discretionary immunity. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about the different relationships and oversight that we have when we're in an independent contractor relationship with a consultant or a contractor versus an employee-employee relationship, and how the way that we direct work or work through problems must be a little bit different. And then I'm open to explore other things with you as you have questions. The first thing I wanted to talk about was the Oregon Tort Claims Act. And I'm going to read it. It's a little bit long, but I want you to be fully aware that if you follow processes that are laid out within ODOT, the processes, you will be protected from personal liability for any mistakes or omissions that may occur. The law actually says the governing body of any public body, so that's ODOT, shall defend, save harmless, and indemnify any employee, there's other people too, but any employee, against tort claims or demands, whether groundless or otherwise, arising out of an alleged act or admission during the performance of their duty. And I'm going to break that apart a little bit because I want you to know how comprehensive this is. The governing body we talked about, that's ODOT, will protect you, the employee of ODOT, from and shall defend, save harmless, and indemnify you. What does that mean? That means that we'll represent you. We will pay all your legal, we will represent you and pay all the legal costs to defend you if something goes wrong. We will indemnify you if there's a judgment against you. The agency will step in and pay all those costs. And oftentimes, depending upon the nature of the action, we will even substitute the name of the agency in for you as an individual. And that sometimes is important to individuals when something happens and you're named in a lawsuit and you're also trying maybe to buy a house on the side, and then your bank may ask if, if you have any pending lawsuits and when you're trying to get your mortgage, and the agency will oftentimes step in. Now, we don't expect this to happen very often, but I just want you to know it's very comprehensive. It's against tort claims, and tort claims are, does anyone know what a tort claim is? Because that's kind of it's not a cake, but in this case, it's a claim for personal injury or injury to property. So something goes wrong, there's an accident, somebody's injured, there's a mishap on a site, equipment is damaged, property, something happens on site and there's a landslide, or any number of things like that is a tort claim. And in the business that you're in, you can imagine that there's probably lots of potential exposure for these kinds of claims. So the agency will step in and defend you for any potential claims that come out within the scope of your job out there. And that's it's whether the claim is groundless or otherwise. So we'll defend you if it's oftentimes we see claims that are groundless, but we still defend you. And these are claims that arise out of alleged acts. So in a positive affirmative act, you said or you did something to cause something to happen, or more likely in the case of project managers, it may be an omission. Something was overlooked. Something didn't occur in the right way that you had anticipated. And then that resulted in an injury or resulted in damage. But that occurs during the performance of your duty as an employee of ODOT. So this does not cover, for those of you who are engineers, the fact that you may have designed Uncle Bernie's deck or something on your spare time. It applies only to the work that you're doing for ODOT in the scope of your employment. So you have processes that you are learning about or have been applying over the years, and requirements for certain documentation. And if you are following those processes and properly documenting, you are acting in the scope of your employment. Even if you followed the process and it resulted in something like an injury or some sort of damage. So if you stay within the framework of those processes, you are free, the state will step in and you're free from liability. Now, it's never that clear. and you're out there in the field or you're out working and your workloads are high, you have a lot of competing issues and things can be overlooked. We will still defend you unless it was a willful act that you knew you were overlooking and not applying the process, but you did it anyways, which I don't think anyone here would do, but or it was a wanton disregard or neglect of duty. A wanton neglect of duty. That's a very high standard. That means it was malicious or characterized by extreme recklessness or foolhardiness. So if you stay within the process sideboards that you have, and you're really working hard to do that, the state will defend you. It's only when you maybe are inserting your own opinion that may be outside of what the processes are that might be considered a wanton disregard. And that's a factual determination, and we'll be looking at the facts and the determination of whether or not we would be able to defend you and indemnify you under this, the Tort Claim Act. But I'm assuming that none of you are going to do that anyways, but I wanted to let you know that we have your back, and the law has your back. And as long as you're working within the processes that have been mapped out for you, and you're documenting those processes, and you're doing what is expected of you, you're going to be fine. And even if it slips and slides a little bit, you're still going to be fine unless there was some overt action to disregard what you were supposed to be doing. So that was the first thing I wanted to. Oh.
Bonnie, can you give a recent example that comes to mind where ODOT or where DOJ has defended an ODOT employee? Anything come to mind recently?
We had, we changed the law a little bit. A lot of you who have been around for a long time remember the Tamal Creek incident. And Molly's here, and maybe she wants to explain it to you, because I think you were kind of in the fray.
Well, a little bit. Tumult Creek was a fish passage project that we had up on the Columbia, big pipe. And the bottom line is procedures were not followed by the contractor, and lots of fish got killed. And at that point, we didn't have a FAP. We were doing everything by biological assessment and biological opinion. And so when you kill a threatened or endangered species, there's criminal repercussions. And there was much angst with regard to the folks that were directly involved with that, the folks that wrote the BA. And when you have a biological assessment, a biological opinion, there's terms and conditions that have to be followed during construction. And those terms and conditions were not followed. The creek basically went dry during construction. And as we all know, fish don't do well on dry land. So, so that's the...
And ODOT employees went out and tried to physically move the fish into water to try to save the fish, but under the Endangered Species Act, that was considered a take, and there was strict liability. And because of that, we were unable to defend. We've changed that now because because those employees were acting in the scope of their employment, and we were able to work through it. But those particular employees that were actually trying to save the fish were put in a really awkward position. So since then, we've tried to change that so that even though they were not supposed to be killing the fish, they were actually trying to lift the fish into the water, and some of them died. And but we've changed that so that it's broader now and that we can defend. It happens sometimes where we're not following, it can happen when we're not following the protocols that have been laid out on some of the permits as well. So another thing that I wanted to point out to you, because a lot of you may be in positions where you can help, is there's a wonderful, well, not a wonderful, but there is a defense called discretionary immunity that is available to government entities to defend against a tort claim. So oftentimes our tort claims come in from individuals who have had some sort of auto accident out on the highway. And often these are horrific accidents. It may be a fatality or a very life-altering injury. And individuals they're definitely injured. There's no question about this. And then they'll look at the design of the highway, or they'll look at why did this occur? And sometimes, the agency, ODOT, you can't put every safety factor in every place across the state. You can't anticipate and design and build every single safety feature everywhere across the state. So you prioritize. And you have programs that prioritize how you're going to address safety issues. For instance, your arts program identifies and prioritizes your SPIS sites, and based on that, we apply money in certain situations to improve the highway design or whatever the safety concern is, leaving some off the map. I mean, we don't get down to some of the other ones, and if the accident occurs below the line, that's one example, we can make a defense called discretionary immunity saying, we considered all of this, and we made a policy determination to expend our funding on these top 5 projects because we have this matrix and it has the highest, whatever your rationale is, it doesn't matter. And you document that. And that can be used as a defense. It can be used as a defense for the types of materials that are called out. There may be 2 kinds of guardrail. Both meet minimum standards, but one is, let's say, twice as expensive, and maybe it's a little safer. But ODOT can make a decision, document that decision, that they considered installing a guardrail A or guardrail B, but we went with guardrail A because guardrail A was less expensive. And then let's say there's an accident that occurs and somebody says, oh, if you had used guardrail B, the injury would not have been as horrific. We can use the decision that was made to defend, it's a defense, the agency. That can work for materials, it can work for when you're out on a project. You may recognize that, and this happens a lot, that there is a safety issue at this intersection, but it would cost $3 million to fix it, and we don't have that. So we're going to make a smaller incremental change for maybe $500,000 because that's all we have in our budget right now. And if it's documented correctly, that you considered both options, and you can make a policy decision, and that should defend the agency. The important part about discretionary immunity is it has to be documented. And oftentimes we make decisions and we don't document it because they're split-second decisions, or they're decisions that may seem kind of like a no-brainer to you, and we just move forward. But if you're making that kind of a decision, it has to be documented. It has to be documented by the individual who has the authority to make the decision. So some of you may have the authority to make some of the decisions. Other decisions probably need to be elevated up, like design exceptions get elevated up to the state engineer and otherwise. But as long as we have that documented, we should be able to use that as a defense. And that can be really, really helpful for the agency. The problem we've been having in trying to apply that defense is tracking the documentation. And this agency is, part of what I love about this agency is it's really big, and there's lots of people in specialties, but lots of decisions are made in different places. And it's hard to track that, the train of decision-making all the way through. And I understand that well, I know you're all paperless now, and that there are ways to track decisions. And so we may need, you may not think it's important at the time, but if you're documenting a decision at your level, it is important because it may come back later on and we'll have to piece it together with other decisions in order to formulate a solid defense. So my third topic that I wanted to talk to you about is about the independent contractor relationship you have with consultants and with contractors versus an employee-employee relationship. And they're different, and the agency's moving more into managing our contractors and consultants. And of course you're managing the employees too, but it's two different types of management. And when we apply a management style that works for employees, employers, to an independent contractor, we run into problems. As you're managing an independent contractor, a consultant, you really only have the authority to approve and accept work or not approve or not accept work. You can't tell that individual how to do the work. Where in an employer-employee relationship, all of you that work for ODOT, we certainly can instruct, tell people how to do their work, ask them to redo it, step in, even rewrite things or redo things, supervise closely, all the way down to, there's a lot of work, and it's an employer-employee relationship. But when we're dealing with a contractor, we can't do that. So somebody gave me this little example, and it's a little bit simplistic, but I kind of liked it. You're making pizza, and you're going to make, if you're an employer and an employee-employer relationship, you're making pizza at home with your children. So you go to the store and you buy all the ingredients, and you come home and you instruct your children to mix up the flour, and you might mix it up with them and help them, and then you spread it out. You might actually roll it out yourself. You add the toppings. You don't necessarily have to follow the recipe. You might follow the recipe. You can alter the recipe. You can do whatever you want. You add all the toppings. You can decide you might want to bake it. You can decide what temperature you want to bake it at. And then you prepare the pizza, and you can work as closely with the individuals in your kitchen in deciding the ingredients and everything. You have total control over it. But then when you're in an independent contractor situation, imagine that you're going to a restaurant and you're ordering a pizza, and the pizza comes to you and you don't like it. You don't go into the kitchen and tell the pizza maker, it's probably some kid, how to make the pizza. You don't go in there and you start, you don't go in there and pound out the pizza dough or try doing whatever they do in the pizza places. You don't go in there and you say, oh, I don't like this kind of pepperoni. I'm going to go to Fred Meyer's and get some different pepperoni. You don't go in there and you don't remake the pizza. You either accept it when it comes to the table and you go, oh, this is not what I ordered. I ordered a pepperoni pizza and this has a lot of pineapple on it, so you can reject it. Or you can say, well, I ordered 3 pizzas and I'm only getting 1, so you can argue over the quantity of it, but you can't go make the pizza. So when you're working with your independent contractor, you can't do their job for them. And it gets really complicated sometimes because you're working quickly to get work done, and you're reviewing work, and sometimes it's just easier, I find myself doing this myself, to just do it. When I'm reviewing documents, I will look at a document, and sometimes I'll see something and it's like the facts don't line up with this is a document I'm reviewing on behalf of ODOT. And they'll be working through, and I know what the standard of review is, and they'll provide some facts, and the facts are inconsistent with their conclusion. They'll come up with a conclusion that says, there are no impacts. But, up here I saw that they identified a couple of impacts. It would be so much easier for me to say, oh, well, there are no likely impacts, and just insert the word likely or modify the language a little bit, rather than writing a whole diatribe about this seems inconsistent, you use this, these facts don't seem appropriate. But if I go in there and I change the language, and then the consultant that ODOT hired, it's passed on and it goes to the consultant, changes it because I asked them to change it, and then that language is challenged later on, in that conclusion or language was challenged, that consultant can say, well, legal counsel told us to, and it's no longer their conclusion. And no, suddenly ODOT is responsible, or if I wasn't working for DOJ, if I was an ODOT employee, ODOT is now responsible for that conclusion, and if that conclusion was wrong, you own it. And I'm sure you have lots of examples where you're trying to oversee a consultant or a contractor, and it would just be so much easier to go in and just do it. But it's really important to hold that line and instruct them that it's not the work or whatever the issue is not consistent with your specifications, and you're not approving the work. And you can give suggestions sometimes. It depends if it's telling them how to do the work, or remind them that this is the standard of review, or circle back to what they're supposed to be doing. But it is very different than in working with your peers or other employees within the agency. And so that's just a reminder. I know a lot of you know this. It's an area that gets real muddy. There's not bright lines. We would like it to have really bright lines. There aren't bright lines. It gets muddy and dirty and murky. But if you ever have a question or you have a concern about it, I would go back to the pizza analogy and go, am I in the kitchen telling them what kind of pepperoni to put on the pizza? Or am I just rejecting what's already in the scope of work? And I think if you can somehow have some internal compass that when you start feeling yourself kind of drifting, to ask yourself that question again. Because once we move over and you start taking over the work of the independent contractor, you're also buying the liability, potentially. Yes?
Is it on? There you go. I think about all of the plans that we may look at, and with a consultant, a range of written documents we may look at, and what I see is it's very common to do a sort of pass back and forth, right? So someone develops the plans, you review them and redline them, right? Now, I think what I'm hearing is it needs to be clear that the folks on the other end get to choose whether to accept the red lines or not, but I'm really asking, if that's the case, do we need to be clearer in that discussion that it's almost like having a disclaimer saying, well, we've written these comments, but you really get to choose.
Well, ultimately, you get to choose whether to accept it or not. And so your red line, if it's it's complicated, and it depends. But if your red line is, this does not meet the standards, and we have these standards here, that's fine, and you can reject it. If you're within the standards and you're choosing A over B, that really ought to fall on the independent contractor side, if it meets everything else that the agency has established. Which is really hard for us because all of you are professionals and you're good at your work, and you bring to the table your own understanding of what works, what doesn't work, and we all know that there's not a bright line, there's not a right, well, and some things there is a right and a wrong, but most of it is in the gray area. And part of the reason that you're working for ODOT is you bring that experience to the table, and they want that experience. So it is really hard to back off. And I think David is going to talk a little bit more about that later on today. I don't even want to pretend to be an engineer. I have a son that's one, but I don't know what he does. And there are standards in there. When you're in the planning world, there are standards as well. And what I have seen, and I have stepped over the line myself, I will admit that on occasion, because we need to get the document out, and for some reason the consultant just didn't seem like it was getting it right, and so we kind of accelerated that process. But it's probably best on the conclusions in a plan, and that we not direct those conclusions. You can go through on a plan and say, we don't think we have enough facts to support that, beef that up. That's okay. We don't, on the conclusions, sometimes it's an A or a B, and it may be a discretionary decision for the agency ultimately to make, and hopefully you built that into your planning process so that the consultant is to bring you options, of which the agency will document and approve one or more. But the actual findings that go into that should be the consultants. I probably didn't help very much. It's all very facts specific. But it is hard when you are all professionals and you all have your own ideas, and now you're trying to ensure that the consultant that you hired does the work as well as you would, and sometimes they have different ideas. Yes?
I didn't see,
Oh,
I didn't see the, Dennis. Raise your arm.
Just to be clear, so are you saying if we were to get into directing means and methods of a consultant, are we assuming their liability, or are we creating a whole new set of liabilities by doing that?
if we get too far into their sandbox, we're creating our own liability. Because at that point, we're directing it and then we're owning it, owning the conclusions, in which case, if we, let's go back to a plan, if the plan was the consultants and we, well, let's say they're engineering plans, they sign off, they stamp it. But if you had told them, no, we want this kind of beam, not that kind of beam, and then the beam fails because you directed it, the consultant will sue us because you directed that beam instead of the other beam. That's way too simplistic, but it's how far you get into the sandbox, what you're directing, how you're directing it, and what, you know, sometimes you can finesse language in a document to make it read better, but if you're changing conclusions, that's where we start to run into problems. And also, we run into problems too when we're over supervising. I don't know if we're doing this anymore, but in the past, sometimes we've had consultants that are nested inside an ODOT facility. We're working on a project together closely. It's not advisable because it gets a little too cozy. And you're all working together on a project, and then the consultant person, you know, they have an ODOT phone number, they have an ODOT email address, and who's supervising who, and at some point, that person may claim to be an employee even outside of the tort claim matter and seek employee benefits. I mean, we can step way over the line. And the law here is evolving, but it isn't favoring government entities in doing business in that way. Yes, sir.
How is it? I want to ask you a question that is basically probably several of us in this room are facing right now. We're developing a quality control, quality assurance for Region 1. And one of the issues that we have been discussing is that once during the quality audit of a consultant job, if there is a significant difference of opinion between the professional of record who stamps the drawing from consultant side and us from the ODOT side don't agree on something, what would be the solution that complies with ethical law in Oregon? Do we have to do it double stamped or just reject it? And what would be the result with the discussion that you just made?
That's a really complicated question, and I really think we need to bring in, are you working with Rob Gephardt at all on this? I think we need to bring Rob in, and he's a colleague of mine. You probably have worked with Rob, most of you in construction, and get his opinion on it, and he will shop that among the different people in DOJ to get an opinion on how to best address that. I don't want to shoot from the hip here, and it's a complicated matter, and I think Rob can probably help you better, and I can certainly, I don't know your name, Ollie? Okay, I can flag that issue.
So just to follow up on that discussion, can you talk a little bit about if you compare internal projects where we are the engineer of record, it's our liability. If you were to go out and have a consultant do the work, but then you overstep the lines, in a way, in a very simplistic way, it seems like we're just taking the liability back, and we might not be worse off than we were as if we'd been doing it on our own. Can you talk about why it is worse that when we're working with a consultant, if we step in and mess it up, that's worse than if we'd had it to begin with and messed it up?
Well, if you had it to begin with, you wouldn't mess it up. So you're really buying additional liability. I have I have so much confidence in the capacity, and you folks are really smart, well-trained professionals. And so I have total confidence in the work that ODOT does. What you're now being faced with is a different model of delivering projects because, well, you have a lot of projects. The legislature has directed us to do more work using consultants, and so we need a new kind of skill set in order to manage those kinds of consultants. But we don't want their liability on top of it. So I'm starting from the premise that you would have done it right. And then, but when we get into the sandbox and start mucking it up, we're buying liability.
So Bonnie, you've provided a lot of great information about things for all of us to consider in the course of our work. Something that really helps resonate are examples, and I like your pizza analogy. Can you provide an example where there was a tort claim? I know you've had several that you've provided in the past, but a tort claim where there was a scope change, a scope reduction in a project, or a scope addition, but a lack of documentation, and how that kind of played out through the process?
I don't have one exactly on point, but the one that we keep going back to is the Turner case. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and we were trying to apply the doctrine of discretionary immunity to that case. This was a matter in Depot Bay, where we all know how Highway 101 is there, and then the county, I think, had roads that intersected with 101 at the ocean, so they were T intersections. ODOT, in Depot Bay, we all know there's taffy shops and knick-knack shops and restaurants there, and so it was really important for the people or the community of Depot Bay to maintain their parking spaces. But as cars come down the hill and they wanted to make a left turn, they have to kind of creep out into the lanes of traffic to see, because the cars are diagonally, the parking is diagonal there. And what happened was a young man was going northbound on a motorcycle, and a woman was attempting to make a left turn. So she creeped out. It was an illegal traffic move, but to see around the trucks that were parked, and the young man collided with her vehicle, and he's a paraplegic now. And he was 18 or 19 at the time of the accident. So there had been complaints that people couldn't see around the traffic. ODOT has since eliminated parking there to just motorcycle parking, so that the visual impediment isn't there to see around it. There had been concerns and a plan. ODOT had given Depot Bay money, I think it was TGM money, to develop a plan to improve the circulation in that area, which included eliminating a few parking places. It included bulb outs, which were ultimately put in weeks after the accident, that cleared some of the visual space. And what we didn't do, and there were also concerns that maybe we needed to put in different kinds of signing. I can't even remember what they were suggesting. And we had the plan. Depot Bay had adopted the plan, but there was nothing that said that ODOT had adopted it. So it wasn't ODOT's plan. We had not documented why we hadn't eliminated the parking or changed the parking. We hadn't done, it was challenging because the improvements went in, it was a different, I think it was a quick it was a different program. I think it was the bicycle ped program that made the improvements, but then suddenly the improvements arrived shortly after the accident. So plaintiff was making the connection that we knew it and we could have fixed it in advance. But you know how these things are in the pipeline for a long time, and we don't build things overnight. But so we were unable, because we didn't have it documented, that of these other considerations, we were able to really put forward that defense. So we ended up settling, and you know, the sad thing about that one is, you know, the young man is still a paraplegic, and his you know, you have to look at it from that point of view too. And I don't think any of the engineers or maintenance people did anything wrong. It was just unfortunate. And had we prioritized that or made a decision and documented that this is the way we're going to proceed with this intersection issue, and as soon as we have funding for it, we'll construct it, would have been helpful. I don't know if that totally answered your question.
It helps. I think just seeing how what you speak to and how that's actually applied and how it plays out, because we are in a very litigious society today. We get tort claims constantly, and ODOT risk and DAS does a great job of managing those risks, but when it goes above and beyond where now we have to engage DOJ, it gets very expensive and very costly.
You know, and we're dealing with, do you remember that, I'm sorry, I know I'm
Go
running
ahead.
late. Remember that it was a horrific accident? Remember the Korean tour bus that went off Cabbage Hill? It was a while ago, but like 9 or 10 people died.
Yeah, Ace Clark had just showed those photos the other day, Cabbage Hill with that big accident.
So it isn't done with. But the plaintiffs are arguing we should have had, and this was an accident, but the conditions were horrific. The bus driver was hadn't had much sleep, from what we understand, and I think was speeding to make up time down Cabbage Hill. And but the plaintiffs are arguing that ODOT should have put up more of those electric signs that say "slow down," "bad weather." Help me. Yeah.
The variable message signs.
Variable message signs and we didn't have any up there at the time. So what we need to document is why we didn't have any up there at the time, or how we consider putting those variable message signs up at the time of the accident. I think we have more of them now, but at the time of the accident it was a pretty new technology, and I think we were only using them in pilot locations. So we have to document, you know, if we can document that it was only used in pilot locations, that should probably get us over it, or at least that's the theory. I don't want to talk too much about that one because we still have some active litigation, but that's where it comes into play, even though, you know, if you read the newspaper article, it appears that probably ODOT didn't do anything that it could have changed the outcome, but sometimes that isn't the way litigation goes. You know, 9 people died.
All right, thank you for your wise words and coming here and presenting and having us consider things as we move forward in the course of work. So if everyone can give Bonnie a round of applause.